Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a name that, let's be honest, you've definitely heard before, Karl Marx, a figure who inspires everything from revolutions to really heated debates. So, we're going to unpack his biggest ideas and figure out, why do we still talk about him so much? All right, let's just jump straight in with the one sentence that is pretty much the key to unlocking his entire worldview. Marx believed that if you strip away all the details of history, you're left with one fundamental story, a constant struggle between different classes, the rich versus the poor, the powerful versus the powerless. And for him, that conflict, well, that's the engine that drives everything forward. So here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to build his argument from the ground up, piece by piece. We'll start with his blueprint for how history even works, then we'll look at what he saw as the engine driving society. From there, we'll dig into the human cost of it all, put his ideas on trial against some big criticisms, and then, this is the cool part, we'll see what it all means for us, right here, right now. Okay, so how did Marx think history actually works? What makes the whole thing tick? Well, his starting point was pretty bold. He looked at a super popular idea from his time, and he basically flipped it on its head. So you had this big shot philosopher, Hegel, who said that our ideas, our consciousness and our beliefs, that's what shapes the world around us. Marx comes along, takes a look, and goes, nope, it's the other way around. He argued that our material reality, the actual physical stuff like our economy, our resources, who owns what, that's the foundation that shapes how we think, how we organize ourselves, and everything else. And he came up with a really powerful way to picture this. Think of society as a building. The foundation of that building, what he called the economic base, is, you guessed it, the economy. This isn't just about money. It's about the tools we use, the resources we have, and most importantly, the relationships between people. Who owns the factory and who works there? That's the base. Then, everything else, and I mean everything, our laws, our politics, our religion, our culture, even how we think about family, that's all part of the superstructure. It's the rest of the building sitting right on top of that foundation, and its shape is totally determined by the base. Now, for Marx, the implication here was huge. It was revolutionary. If you want to change the world, you don't just argue about ideas. You have to change the economic foundation itself. Okay, but that brings up a pretty big question, right? If the economy is the foundation, what makes the foundation itself change? How do we get from, say, feudalism to capitalism? For Marx, the answer was simple and powerful: conflict. And to get what he means by conflict, we need to wrap our heads around one key concept, the mode of production. Just think of it like the economic system of any given era. It's made of two basic things: the forces of production, that's all the tech, the tools, the resources, and the relations of production, which is just a fancy way of saying who owns all that stuff and who has to do the work. And this is where you can really see Marx's big picture view of history. He didn't see it as just one random thing after another. No, he saw it as a clear progression, moving through these different stages. And here's the kicker. Each stage, each mode of production, carries the seeds of its own downfall. So feudalism, with its lords and serfs, created the conditions that eventually led to capitalism, with its owners and workers. And what drives that change every single time? That bubbling, simmering class conflict. So if you look at each of these eras, Marx saw the same basic pattern emerge again and again. Society splits into two major groups. You've got the haves, the masters, the lords, the capitalists. These are the people who own the stuff you need to make more stuff, the land, the tools, the factories. And then you've got the have-nots, the slaves, the serfs, the workers, who basically have nothing to sell but their own ability to work. And for Marx, that tension, that constant push and pull between these two groups, that's the real engine of history. All right, so that's the big, zoomed-out view of history. But what does all this mean for the actual people living through it? What does it feel like to be a person in one of these systems, especially capitalism? This gets us to something Marx cared a lot about: the human cost. I mean, have you ever had a job where you just felt like a tiny, replaceable cog in some giant machine? Well, Marx had a word for that exact feeling. He called it alienation. He argued that the capitalist system itself creates this profound sense of being disconnected from what you're making, from the people around you, and ultimately from your own true self. And this wasn't just some vague, fuzzy feeling for him. No, he was very specific. He believed this alienation shows up in four really clear and kind of damaging ways. Okay, so first, you're alienated from the thing you make. You might spend all day assembling a car, but it's not your car. Second, you're alienated from the process of working. You don't decide how to do it, you just follow the instructions, a robot on an assembly line. Third, you're alienated from other people. You're told to compete with your coworkers for a promotion, not cooperate with them. And finally, and this is the big one, you become alienated from yourself, from your own human potential. Work isn't about creativity or purpose anymore, it's just about getting a paycheck to survive. Now, you can't come out with a theory this huge and this controversial and not expect some pushback, right? Of course not. So let's play devil's advocate for a bit. We're going to put Marx's ideas on trial and look at some of the biggest critiques. Take the sociologist Max Weber, for example. He looked at Marx's neat and tidy two-class system and basically said, hold on, it's a lot messier than that. Weber argued that capitalism wasn't just going to create two warring camps. Instead, it would give rise to a massive, sprawling middle class. Managers, specialists, office workers, which totally complicates that simple owner versus worker picture. Then you've got Rolf Dahrendorf, who tweaked the idea a bit. He said, hey, maybe it's not just about who owns the stuff. Maybe it's about who's in charge. He believed the real conflict comes from authority. Think about any workplace. There's always a tension between the boss who gives the orders and the employees who have to take them. And that conflict can exist whether you're in a private company or a government agency. And a more recent critique from people like the economist Amartya Sen points to a potential blind spot in Marx's theory. The argument is that by focusing so intensely on class, Marx kind of downplayed all the other things that shape our identities and cause conflict. Things like gender, religion, race, nationality. These are huge drivers of history too, and they don't always fit neatly into an economic box. So, okay, after all those criticisms, you might be wondering, why are we still talking about a guy from the 19th century? Well, here's why. Because if you stop thinking of his ideas as a rigid set of rules and instead use them as a lens, like a pair of glasses, you can suddenly see our world today in a completely different and sometimes startling way. Just think about this for a second. Some people argue that today we're living in a whole new mode of production, one based on data capital. Our personal data, that's the new raw material. And the new means of production, the new factories, they're the algorithms and the massive server farms owned by a handful of giant tech companies. And what does that lead to? Well, maybe a new kind of alienation. There's this idea of the fetishism of social media, where our real human relationships get turned into something else, into commodities, like likes and shares and follower counts. That feeling you get when you're just doom scrolling, endlessly and anxiously. A modern Marxist might look at that and say, yep, that's it. That's alienation in the 21st century. Which leaves us with one final big question to chew on. Marx argued that the great struggle of his time was over capital, over factories and money. So, as we barrel forward into an age of AI and big data, what's the fundamental conflict now? Is the new engine of change a struggle over our data, a battle for our attention, or is it something completely different, something we haven't even really grasped yet?